afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Dawn Haig. I'm part of the PIP team, and I would like to welcome you to the first webinar in our inaugural Feeding Breeders Summit. Feeding breeders is challenging and complex. There's a lot of information to cover, so we have paced these webinars a week apart to give you time to reflect, find connections, and surface insights. Every week, we're going to meet for 1 hour to connect with cutting-edge speakers and panelists. The issues that emerge in all webinars are going to be discussed more deeply during the summit in the Rocky Mountains of Canmore on August 31st and September 1st. Before we start, I'd like to do a quick poll to find out where you're joining from. The poll will pop up on your screen and you can let us know. As we wait for the responses, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today, Brenda Reimer. I'm sure many of you will know Brenda. She's the Tech Transfer Coordinator for the Poultry Innovation Partnership.
Hi, everybody. I'm very excited to be here today.
Thanks, Brenda. A quick explanation about FeedLoop. On the left, on the navigation panel, you'll find the links to view webinars, recordings, visit sponsors, network with other attendees, and link to the discussion board. As a reminder, you should have received an invitation from our peer board site. And if you didn't receive the invitation, under the networking tab, you'll see +1 event assistant. Add your questions there. Our team is ready and happy to help. We really hope that you'll share your thoughts and questions, not only at the webinars, but throughout the week through these discussion boards. Okay, let's have a look at the poll results. It's really exciting to see where everybody's joining from today. Okay, great. Canada, United States, Central America, and Europe all represented. Welcome, everybody. Now, on behalf of the Planning Committee, I'd like to thank the following sponsors whose generous funding makes this event possible. Our presenting sponsors are the Poultry Innovation Partnership and ARDAR, Platinum level sponsor, Aviagen and EW Nutrition, Gold level sponsor, Merck Animal Health, Silver level sponsor, Cargill, Bronze level sponsors, New Life Mills, Country Junction Feeds, Canadian Hatching Egg Producers. Our student sponsor is Adesio. Supporter level and meal sponsors, Chore Time, Canadian Biosystems Incorporated, Alberta Hatching Egg Producers, Richie Smith Feeds, and Alberta Chicken Producers. Thank you so much to all of you. Now, to kick off the Feeding Breeders webinar series, we welcome Dr. Valerie Carney, Poultry Innovation Partnership Lead at the University of Alberta, and Dr. Gina Wilson, Professor at the University of Georgia, to discuss this question: how have changes in broiler genetics affected male and female broiler breeders over the past 60 years? Welcome, Val and Gina.
Well, hello, everybody. I'll just get my slides up and we'll get started. All right, well, it's so great to be here for our inaugural event, and so glad to have all of you joining us. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about how broiler genetic selection over the last few decades has affected broiler breeders. I'm going to start with what we know about broilers, just some highlights from our 50-year trial where we looked at some of the consequences of genetic selection for growth, efficiency, and yield. You probably, many of you probably have seen these 3 chickens before. The one over here on the right is the, or the left, is the Alberta meat control strain representing broilers of 1957. In the middle, Alberta meat control strain representing broilers of 1978. And then at the time, this was the modern broiler, the 2005 Ross 308. And what we found in that study is that by 8 weeks, there was a quadrupling of body weight between the lines, with of course, the more modern bird being 4 times that heavier than the 1957 strain. We also looked at yield, and we saw that, you know, between 1957 and 2005, there was almost a doubling, not quite a doubling in breast meat yield. And with that also came changes in efficiency. So whereas in 1957, it took about 28.2 grams of feed to produce 1 gram of breast meat, it now takes 9.4 grams of feed. Or at that time, it took 9.4 grams. We also looked at feed usage, and I'm presenting usage rather than intake because one of the things that we noticed was that the 1957 strain tended to waste or spill a lot of feed. And this wasn't a unique observation just to our study. We also found that Havenstein, in the Havenstein papers, this was noticed as well. They were using the Athens Canadian random bred, which is a sister line to the 1957 meat control strain. But what we found is that the modern broiler at that time required about 1/3 less feed compared to the 1957 bird. I'm going to look a little bit at allometry. So allometry is basically the comparison of growth of a body part to the body as a whole. And so what we're looking at is, are certain parts of the body growing faster than the whole body? And what we found is that there was an upward shift in breast growth, yield, development in the modern strain compared to the 1957 and 1978. And that's not surprising given that really selection for yield didn't start happening until about the 1970s, maybe even the early 80s. And so that's when we start to see this upward shift. Conversely, if we look at the allometry of fat pad, we can see that there was a downward shift in the 2005 birds, in that they were the growth of that fat pad was growing slower than the rest of the body, essentially, compared to the 1957, and then the 1978 was intermediary. So just briefly, what are the what happened over 50 years of broiler selection? Like I said, there was a quadrupling of the 56-day body weight, improved feed efficiency, and then changes in the relative proportion of yield in that breast yield increased while the fat pad decreased over 50 years. So what does that mean to broiler breeders? Well, if we look over 60 years, we decided to do a trial where we compared what had changed over 60 years with broiler breeders. And this is a paper that we just recently had published. And to do that, we used the 2 strains that we had here in Alberta, which was the 1957 and 1978 meat control strain. And then we brought in 2 benchmark strains from the University of Arkansas that were developed by Dr. Nick Anthony in cooperation with the late Dr. Derek Emerson. And they represented broilers from 1995 and 2015. And so what we decided to do, this was a 2x4 factorial where we had 4 strains and then 2 feeding treatments. They were either feed restricted or full fed or fed ad libitum. And that restriction or the target body weight curve for this treatment was an average of the Ross and Cobb breeder targets for the modern bird at that time. And so why were we doing this? You know, we wanted to look at and understand what had changed. We're in this paradigm where we know that an overfed full hen packages that extra energy into follicles, and then you end up with this overabundant number of follicles, resulting in erratic oviposition, erratic ovulation, and defective eggs. And so feed restriction was a tool came about as a tool to manage that ovary and really to come to a point where we had a healthy ovary with about 7 large yellow follicles. In this strain, in this trial, similar to what we saw in the 50-year trial, is that right from about 5 weeks on, there was a quadrupling of body weight, and that quadrupling stayed throughout the trial right up until 19 weeks of age, when we caged the birds. So during rearing, they were reared on the floor in a floor pen, and we weighed them weekly and weighed the feed weekly. You can see here that there's 3 lines on top of each other, and that was intentional. That was that was the feed restricted treatments, and so we were intentionally trying to get them to be the same weight. So we did fairly well with that. You'll also notice at the bottom there's that black line, and that's the 1957 strain. So we started feed restriction when the birds reached the target body weight. Well, the 1957 strain never did reach the target body weight, and so therefore they were never feed restricted. We wanted to look at how restricted are these birds relative to their genetic potential. And what we found is that in the 2015 line, those birds were restricted to about 25% of their genetic potential. So compared to the birds, the same treatment or the same strain of birds that was full fed, they were about 25% of the body weight. And in the blue is the 1995, 1978, and of course the black is the 1957. We look at cumulative feed intake, we can also see that those restricted birds were consuming around 25% of what they could consume if you were to allow them to have full access to feed. Now you might also be looking at this graph and wondering what is going on with those 1957 birds with that jump right off the start. And what, again, this points back to that feed spillage and wastage. So they were wasting a lot of feed. And then out around 15 weeks, it got really interesting because they were essentially not eating very much, but still gaining appropriately. And so what we hypothesize is that they were actually eating some of the feed that they had spilled earlier, and we're finding it in the litter. When we look at energy efficiency, so what we were looking at here was heat production. What we saw is that, there was this linear increase in heat production in the full-fed birds, from 1978 to 1995 to 2015. But when we looked at the restricted treatment, we saw that there, under feed restriction, the 2015 line was the most efficient. And it was interesting to us because, feed restriction increases efficiency by reducing the heart rate, blood pressure, and body temperature. And so we wondered, is there something going on here? Is there some sort of stimulus for a metabolic shift in the more restricted birds so that they become more energetically conservative? We also looked at breast weight at sexual maturity, also very interesting to us, in that we can see that even under feed restricted conditions, breast yield was higher in the 1995 and 2015 lines, indicating that there's a metabolic priority for breast meat yield. And again, if we look at that relative growth of the breast compared to the rest of the body, we can see again that upward shift in the 2015 line. In the blue is the 1995, and then very similar to what we saw in the 50-year trial, really no difference between that trajectory between the 1957 and 1978 lines. Similarly, the fat pad was also, we also noted that downward shift in fat pad compared to the other lines. In the 2015 line, they have a lower proportion of fat pad compared to the previous generations. This isn't surprising when we look at the papers that have been published and kind of did a retrospective look. We see that back in the 80s, late 80s, broiler breeder fatness was coming in at around 18% of the total carcass. And then in more recent papers, we're seeing that is being reported, at 10% or even less. Total carcass fatness has declined by 8 to 10% over the last 30 years. So one of the things that was a bit shocking for us to see was exactly that, sort of the fat pad level or the fat pad size at photostimulation. So this is when these birds are getting ready to go to create an ovary, which is largely made out of fat. And so they don't have, in that 2015 line, they had about 0.5% of body weight in that fat pad. And so that was quite shocking to us. Versus these modern day or these older strains where they had significantly more fat pad, and that even in full fed conditions, you can see that the 2015 line wasn't depositing as much fat. We look at sexual maturity, again, that 2015 line had the lowest amount of fat compared to any other treatment, especially under feed restricted conditions. So what changed? And so I think one of the things that happened right around the early 2000s was the way that we selected for feed conversion. And so previous to the 2000s, this is how it was done. A bird was put in a cage, it was weighed, but prior to going in, and also at the end of some period. And the feed that it was provided was weighed and then measured as the bird was coming out. So we looked at how much did it grow and how much feed did it take. But this was kind of an artificial situation because the birds were not moving and not having to compete for feed. And so then in the 2000s, there was a real shift in the way that we measured feed conversion thanks to technology, where we had these types of systems that could provide a pen situation where there was still movement of the birds, possibly even competition at the feeder. And the data that was collected here gave us a lot more insight into how much the bird ate, how many times it ate, how much it ate at each meal. And all of this information has been used for genetic selection, and it has enabled us to make better assessments of who has the best feed conversion. So what has changed? Let's just review. We went over some of those changes in broiler selection. Of course, growth, improved efficiency, and then that upward shift in breast yield and the reduction in fat pad. And then what does that mean to a broiler breeder? We see they have the same genetics, so we're not surprised to see very similar things, quadrupling in the body weight. But under feed restriction, some of the things that are surprising is because of that improvement in body weight, we are really holding them back to about 25% of what they possibly could achieve in terms of body weight. And with that comes some efficiencies gained in how they're using their nutrients. And again, those changes in the relative growth of the breast and decreased deposition of fat. So what? So modern birds have been selected for growth, yield, and feed efficiency, probably not surprising or new to anybody. But since fat is energetically expensive, the unintended consequences have been to select for reduced fatness. And contemporary strains are also showing us that they're prioritizing breast development through sexual maturity, indicating that growth is a metabolic priority over reproduction. So it leaves us with these questions. Now what? Fatness is important for puberty and of course through the production cycle, the laying cycle, because it's a reservoir during draining times and the development of that ovary. So is puberty being affected? Is the ovary being affected? What's happening to the metabolism signals under feed restriction? There's questions there. These birds are becoming more energetically conservative with their metabolizable energy. And so what's going on? Can we try to understand those signals, and can we utilize them in trying to develop different feeding strategies? Does the increased degree of feed restriction over the decades combined with the lack of fat reserves create welfare and production challenges for this modern broiler breeder? Are they less resilient perhaps during times of stress or nutrient disruption? And how should we be feeding modern broiler breeders to optimize welfare and production? So I've left you with a lot of questions, but I'm hoping that this will stimulate some of the discussion throughout the webinar series and at the summit. And that's all I have. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gina, and then we'll do some question and answer period at the end. So take it away, Gina.
Okay, let me share my screen here. think I've got that set up. No, not quite yet. Here we go. Let's change topics here and talk about broiler breeder males. So broiler breeders really haven't been actively managed until the last 20 years. So 40, 50 years ago, they were just part of the flock, a necessary part, obviously. We were managing that flock for egg production, and the roosters were fed the same amount, had the same access to feed as the hens because there was only one feeding system in there. So really rooster management was extremely limited to just health and mobility. And when fertility started dropping below 95% as we moved more into high yielding birds and selecting them for more efficiency, we started to look at how we could manage these birds for maximum fertility, because initially a lot of the selection was on the male side. That's not exactly true today, but certainly years ago it was. So what did we talk about? What was the emphasis? We figured out that we had to restrict body weight gains in these roosters to encourage them to continue naturally mating and to reduce any type of leg and foot pad problems that were apparent with more and more weight. We also found out from a genetics point of view that skeletal conformation was changing with our selection for growth. We also determined that breast deposition was impeding cloacal contact in natural mating. So the bigger the male got, the less capable he was in actually inseminating the female. And in some more recent work, we found that even the width of the pelvis of the rooster was negatively impacting our ability to have good fertility in these flocks. So again, when you look at a male, a rooster mounts the hen, and the more and more breast meat you put on this rooster and general size of the bird, you can pretty quickly see how we have impacted fertility. It's just difficult for them to stay on the female long enough to actually inseminate. And then if you throw in feet and leg issues because of excessive weight, it's pretty obvious why fertility has declined. Now, how did we impact this? In the early 80s, there was a professor at Auburn University, a fellow by the name of Gaynor McDaniel, and he teamed up with an industry person, Gerald Bailey, who was a longtime complex manager in Coleman, Alabama for Goldkist. And they worked together in Goldkist facilities to look at feeding the hens and the roosters in the laying house separately. And this system is well known to us today. It's called sex separate feeding. And we have refined at this practice, and it's really been adopted worldwide. If we had not had these innovative individuals come up with this feeding system, we probably would be inseminating these birds like the turkey industry has perfected today. So in managing these roosters, our goals are and have to be to minimize breast fleshing. We need an upright posture in these birds. We need libido. We need their natural interest in mating, but they have to have good feet and legs along the way too to be competitive in these breeder facilities. And of course, we want to reduce mortality and injury. We are looking at welfare aspects of these birds for more positive natural behavior in these breeding flocks. So we know we can restrict the dietary intake by imposing these sex separate feeding systems, we're limiting the body weight gain and we're getting some good mating behavior. Along the way, we also have a more novel idea of managing these roosters for their particular dietary needs. We're really only finding out in recent times that we really need to be feeding them and formulating the diets to maximize semen production and quality. So again, we have to identify these feed ingredients that might improve reproduction in these birds. We also have some management things that we have figured out. In the early 90s, we stopped dubbing roosters. The picture on your right is a dub rooster. Many of you that are young have probably never seen a dub rooster, but a full comb, single comb male will look like the picture on your left. And it gives us a lot more to work with to limit that maturing cockerel's access to the hen's feeder. So by 27, 30 weeks of age, they will have a full comb and we can block them for the most part out of the female feeder. So that was one thing that came to us as a management change. So we have these sex separate systems. Here you see on your left, the rooster feeder that would be lowered into a scratch area. And you would see this is just one example of a female feeder up on the slats, a trough type feeder. Both of these systems have to work together to feed these birds well, but on the male side, we have the rooster feeder high enough that the hen really has very little access to his feed. And the picture on your right, you see the design of that opening, the size of the opening on that female feed trough, whether it's a trough or a pan, is designed to keep the rooster with that full comb out of her feed trough so that she's eating the feed she needs and the type of feed she needs for egg production, and the rooster will get what he needs from his trough in both the amount and the nutrients that they need. Another big difference we see today is rooster conformation. In the 80s, we allowed these roosters to put on a lot of breast meat, was not unusual. And again, that forced a lot of the fertility declines. In this picture on your right of a 2022 rooster, you can see smaller body size, less breast conformation. But again, that has come through a lot of feed restriction of these birds. As Val said, we're restricting them to only a portion of what they would like to eat. So sex separate feeding was proven in the late 80s to have some real impact on the behavior of these birds as well. Mating attempts were pretty similar between those that are separately fed versus those that are combined with the hens to feed from the same trough. We see an increase in incomplete matings. We see an increase in overall matings, which is the important part. And if you put all of this together, we have a definite behavioral difference between roosters that are fed separately versus those that are fed combined with the female. And again, these are some important aspects of how we have changed the management of these birds. We need these scratch areas full of birds, primarily in the afternoon and evening. That's when most of the mating activity takes place. And again, if we can get that, we can sustain fertility through hopefully late 50s, early 60s. Okay, so some other areas, again, Fontana in 1990 proved the same thing, that we see higher fertility where the birds are separately fed. So a very important aspect of how management has changed to give us better control of body weight of these roosters and improve fertility. So classic birds versus our very high yielding birds that we've seen since the 1990s on. We are trying to control nutrient intake, and it's critical with these birds to do that to sustain fertility. We are looking at lower density diets for the roosters, which allows us a greater volume where they have the genetic interest in eating. Their appetite is a great deal more voracious than 25 or 30 years ago. That's how we get bigger birds on the broiler side. This also plays out with these breeders. So if we give them more volume, they're more satisfied, even though nutrient wise, we're not giving them as much to eat. Generally, we need a uniform group of birds to get good fertility. This will reduce mortality and will also improve welfare in these birds. Okay, so what about some specific diet formulations for these males? We know that the roosters don't need the high calcium of that hen diet. They really need a formulation that's about 0.8 to 1% calcium instead of the 3 to 3.5% that's in the hen diet. And we'll talk about this in just a minute. We know that we can get by with lower crude protein because the protein is going to push breast fleshing in these birds. We also know a lower crude protein diet will give us a larger volume of feed to spread amongst the males. But there are other nutrients that we're only just finding that could improve reproduction in these males. The omega-3 fatty acids have long been known to improve reproduction. We'll talk about that. And organic minerals, again, we're finding out that these birds, both males and females, utilize the organic version better than the inorganic. And there will be many more nutrients to come that we will find and improve reproduction. So some of the early studies were done in the late 80s and then in the early 90s. And we looked at crude protein levels between 8 and 16%. I wouldn't recommend anybody go to 8, but certainly we can feed 12 and 13% crude protein to our adult roosters without having any impact on semen production. So lower protein is not a negative to these birds. Again, from a practical perspective, we're keeping them in semen production and mating with these lower density diets. This is some recent work. Kelly Sweeney, who just finished her PhD at the University of Georgia, found some of the same things that we looked at and found in the late 80s, that you can have more consistently larger numbers of males staying in semen production, coming in early and staying in semen production throughout their lives if we can feed a male-oriented or rooster-oriented diet over a hen diet. This work should be published later this year. If we look at the kidneys of the males fed a male diet versus the hen diet, you can pretty quickly see that we have more tubular nephrosis in our roosters eating the hen diet versus those that are eating the male diet. You see the same or similar relationship here with this interstitial inflammation, with the roosters getting the hen diet having more inflammation, and then just overall lesion scores. Again, similar with almost 2 times the amount in the roosters getting the hen diet. So again, this is an extremely important area that tells us that they should not be getting that calcium in their diets. Well, what about the omega-3 fatty acids? Again, I tell you that this work was done many years ago, that we know feeding the omega-3 fatty acids will give us better spermatozoa membrane on these gametes, and we have that through less peroxidation damage in these birds. So we know that we have the potential to get improved motility in these spermatozoa. Some work that was done in the early 2000s by Benton Hudson. You can see if we just replaced poultry fat with menhaden oil and looked at inseminating these hens with a low dose of semen, that we could consistently improve fertility. Most of that coming in the latter part of the lay cycle, where fertility is an issue for these birds. And we really thought that this was through better mobility. This was not adopted by poultry nutritionists, and it's kind of easy to understand why, because fish oil is difficult to handle, and a feed mill has a very short shelf life with some rancidity issues. We can also have some salmonella issues if we don't have good product. So integrators obviously don't want to have a separate feed for the rooster. It's something else to mill, have to have another bin on the farm, and have to transport another feed to the farm. I get all of that, but again, if our fertility and hatches is dropping, our hatch is dropping below 82%, if this is more difficult to achieve, we've got to look at some other ways of sustaining fertility in our flocks, and certainly feeding some omega-3 fatty acids is a good way. Again, looking at Kelly's work, you see the red line being our male diet with a dry DHA product. Again, doesn't have the stability issues that our fish oils did. So omega-3 fatty acid. And you can see we have consistent, better mobility of the spermatozoa versus the male control diet. Here you have the percentage of fertility. If you inseminate once and look at egg fertility over a 14-day period, you can see that we have higher fertility, again, with our DHA supplemented diet versus our male diet. So again, better fertility here. How do you measure that? Just quickly, if you layer the semen on top, if that in over a 5-minute period, if the spermatozoa moves through a thin gel to the bottom to be counted, we know that that spermatozoa will act much in the same way inside the hen and give us more fertile eggs. So again, the mobility of that spermatozoa is key to giving us fertility. What about our mineral sources? Selenium is restricted to about 3% that we can add to poultry diets. So whatever you add, you want it to be most utilized. We have found that inorganic sources of minerals we have used over the years because they're lower cost. That would be something like sodium selenite. Today, the indication is that the more organic forms of selenium are better utilized than the inorganic. This will be a product like a selenoprotein form, and we have seen some sperm maturation improvements. We know it plays a role in sperm maturation, and obviously has some antioxidant values. Here, again, from Kelly's dissertation, you can see very consistent improvement in fertility of diets that are organic, a mix of organic, the selenoprotein and the sodium selenite, over a diet, control diet with the sodium selenite only. So again, if we can improve fertility throughout the life of that flock, we know that that's going to be a big win for most companies. So what are our goals? Our goals are always to grow and develop good testes in these males. And we do this through our management, controlling intake, and providing the right feed ingredients and the right amounts. But we also need to maintain spermatozoa throughout the life of that flock. Again, both combinations of these will help us sustain fertility to a reasonable endpoint on these flocks. So again, just to summarize, sex-separate feeding of hens and roosters is a common practice today, and it gives us the ability to control intake of both sexes so that we have only moderate gains. We can still get good testicular development in these birds, but it really does require a lot of maintenance of male feeders in these facilities. We see people interested, companies interested in male feed formulation. And although it does complicate things in feed mills and on farms to have two different diets, we've got to mill, store, and transport two different diets to the farm, but it is an opportunity to reduce protein and calcium intake for these birds and to give them specific dietary nutrients that they need to sustain spermatozoa. We can reduce breast flushing and kidney issues and improve body weight uniformity. So new ingredients, those we know about and those that we will find in the coming years, can give us the opportunity to improve that semen quality and the longevity of semen production. So we can keep roosters mating and have good quality semen through 65 weeks of age. So that's my summary today in this area. So I will turn it back over to the PIP group.
That was awesome, Gina. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Gina and Val, for your great presentations. It looks like we've got about 20 minutes for questions. You were both shared a lot of information. I see that we've got at least one question in the Q&A box already. If you have questions for Val or Gina, or it doesn't have to be a question, it can be a comment. We're equal opportunity. What we want is to have the opportunity to start discussing and start building our discussion questions as we journey towards the summit, where we will hopefully come up with some plans for the future, research, you name it, that kind of thing. So with that, our first question is probably for Gina, and the question relates to, the question was, what are some feed ingredient examples that increase fertility and semen quality? And you talked quite a bit about that. You talked about the DHAs, you talked about the selenium. But are there any other opportunities that you can see other than those ingredients that we could potentially increase?
Like I say, those are some starting points. I believe that we really only opened the door on the mineral side, because we do use a lot of inorganic minerals in these feeds just as a cost. You know, the DHA, there are several of those on the market out there, and we may find some that are better than others, would be my suspicion there. But you know, again, those are the things that come to my mind. The most obvious are what we've already found to be true. So can't think of anything right straight away that would be in addition to that.
I have a question though related to that. So you talked about the challenges with feeding, you know, something like a fish oil because of the rancidity, and just handling the fish oil. But what about something like, when I think about how we enrich layer diets for omega-3 eggs, you know, we use flax, alfalfa, things like that. Is that an opportunity that, you know, might make it easier?
Certainly, if you go back in the literature, alfalfa has been used in breeder diets. You'd have to go back a ways, but then I do go back a ways.
We are
but-
talking over decades.
yeah. Alfalfa has been used in breeder diets. I don't think it was ever identified exactly what the ingredient in the alfalfa was that improved fertility, but that is known. Again, that's an area that we probably should research again and look at. Again, a lot of things were kind of lightly touched on 20 and 30 years ago, but when fertility hadn't changed very much, it was really difficult to get people interested in having a male feed because of all of the milling aspects of that. So
it was more trouble than it was worth at the time.
Absolutely was. And so we really haven't gone that way.
So this is a question from me. We do have several questions in the box, so I think we're going to fill all of our time. I wasn't worried about filling our time, but watching your presentation, Gina, I noticed that like with DHA, it looked like at the tail end of what you measured, and I forget the weeks, of somewhere in the 50 weeks, there was it looked like about a 7-point difference in fertility between the two diets. And then about 5% maybe ish. I mean, it's hard to tell on a screen like that for selenium. So you've talked a lot about, and I get it, it's expensive, it's hard. Has anyone done the analysis? As an extension person, I think, would that tip the balance to see if you're going to get that much more fertility, how much would that benefit the industry as a whole? Like where?
We're beginning to see some of that done. And does it really play out in an industrial setting? That's, because there's a lot of noise that goes on. And can you still get some positive results? The other question I've been asked is, well, should you use both of these things together? And of course I would, if it were my roosters, I can guarantee you I would. That we're going to find a lot of other things as well. It's a fairly neglected area, I would say.
Cool. Interesting. We have another question. Well, we have several questions. And this one is talking specifically about fat. So they're interested in what about the level of the fat in the male feed? Is there a minimum fat inclusion or is there a metabolizable energy level that you would recommend for male feed?
Very, very good question. I don't know that we have looked at a minimum fat inclusion for roosters. I don't know, but if you look at fat consumption on the female side, normally we're in the 420, 30, maybe even as high as 50 calories per day. But for roosters, we normally think of a minimum of about 350 to 375 calories per day. And I'm sure the more technically, mathematically inclined folks in our group could probably tell us more exactly on that. But that's just based off some work that I did probably, 35 years ago, that we do need to have a minimum level of calories for these roosters.
Okay, thank you, Gina. I have a question here regarding, and it could be for both of you potentially, but the question is, how did the slower growing breeds compare to the historical breeds that were included in the study that Val and the team over here did? So any comments from Val or Gina?
It's not something that we've actually studied, but when we look at the broilers, again, these are birds or lines representing lines of times previous, historical times, and so we know that historically these birds grew slower. The specific genetic makeup of the slow growing breeds and how they perform is not something that we've actually studied. I think we could make some loose, draw some loose conclusions based on just performance of that 1978 or the 57 line. Is similar to some of the slower growing breeds, probably closer to the 1978. The 1957 really is slow.
And special.
And really almost difficult to, what we know about broilers and growth and yield, when we look at that 1957 line, it's kind of hard to even wrap your head around that was a broiler at the time. It looks a lot more like a layer, but the 78 is starting to look a little bit more like a broiler, and so we could probably draw some conclusions looking at those lines, but I would be careful not to go too far with that, just because I haven't looked at those lines. But I would say probably there are some similarities, but that's about as far as I can go without actually studying them.
Cool, thank you, Val. Lots of questions coming in. This is so great. We were hoping that we'd have lots of discussions, so I'm very excited about this. I'm going to ask this next one next. I'm real good with my words today. Gina, what drove the ultimate switch to this sex separate feeding? It was, as you've talked kind of with where we're at with male diets. Was it seen as too expensive, too inconvenient? But what was that tipping point?
I was a young PhD student at the time, and I think the industry could see that fertility was slipping. They had very inconsistent fertility and hatch. I mean, they were still generally able to achieve the hatchability that they needed, but they had to work a lot harder at it. And as I say, they had to start actively managing these roosters, where before they were just birds in the head count of that house. They weren't really managing the roosters for fertility. They were just feeding a bird, and they could see if they continued down that line that they would not be able to sustain the levels of fertility that were expected.
Cool, thank you, Gina. Another question here. What about the frequency of spiking today? Any comments?
The frequency of spiking is definitely worrisome when you think about the biosecurity issue that spiking presents, to be introducing, a group of birds to the breeder house 3 and 4 times over the production cycle. But again, that is being driven by the fact that after 40, 42, 45 weeks of age, fertility is slipping consistently in industry flocks. So again, it's important that we come up with other methods besides just the constant spiking.
Yeah, it's a bit of a band-aid in some regards, and it is costly.
It's very costly.
One of these other things you talked about, different feeds or whatever, yeah, they're costly and a bit of a pain in the backside, but maybe a little bit more sustainable, because cost of raising those spiking males and the risk of constantly spiking.
But in these days of avian influenza, I mean, I know we don't have this threat every year, but we all have seen some real losses and are scared to death, hoping that we're on the decline with that. But when we talk about moving birds as much as we are, it is a huge threat for sure.
Yeah, it's a stopgap, I think, but it's not a sustainable approach, I don't believe.
Right. So, I'm excited about some of these opportunities and the ones that will come that I haven't even imagined yet. But having a male diet is the first step. Until then, we really haven't the opportunity to use these feed ingredients.
So the next question I'm going to throw at you, Gina, is related. And the question is, does feeding omega-3 fatty acids to roosters after a decline in fertility restore fertility above 82%? So do you have to feed it all along, or can it be a rescue situation?
Most of these ingredients that we're finding, the earlier you feed it, the better the opportunity for both the development of the testis and the spermatogenesis in general, but also the maintenance. So some of these things we haven't had a chance to feed from the very beginning, or at least in my group. But again, what we are seeing is the earlier the better. So I wouldn't look at it as a rescue.
It's not a rescue situation. No. The next question is about if we're able to keep the birds longer, maybe reduce the amount of spiking by having the sex separate feed. Do you think the males will maintain their ability and desire to mate as they get older, and we keep them longer potentially?
By longer today, I would say 2 or 3 years ago, I really thought that we would not be keeping birds past 60 weeks. And I know in Canada that is pretty typical, but in the United States, we've tried to keep them through 65 weeks. And 2 or 3 years ago, I didn't see too many flocks that were kept that long. But I'm hoping that we can sustain that sort of management of these birds. Past that, I only see an occasional flock that's able to go into their late 60s. Although with AI, we've had to push that envelope and keep birds in the field much longer. But again, I do think the 65 is possible if we can, again, control their gain and their breast fleshing, and then sustain semen quality.
We talk about unintended consequences, with Val, the presentation Val did, we talk about unintended consequences, and, we don't want AI, but we may have some field information about we would rather not have it, but if we have to have AI, maybe we'll have some information about, how much longer we can sustain those flocks, and that can lead to more sustainability of the industry. So that there's a silver lining in every cloud, maybe is one way of saying that. Maybe it'll be interesting to see that. We still have a couple minutes for questions. It looks like we've got about 4 minutes, and there's still 4 questions. So I think I'm going to go to this one. When you say they are more energetically conservative today now than in the past, what exactly you're meaning about this? The hens will save energy for maintenance instead of egg production. So that might be.
Yeah, you have to. So what I'm talking about when I say energetically conservative, I was looking at heat loss. So if you looked at those birds that were full fed, they had excess energy, and a lot of it was being lost to heat. But under feed restricted conditions, there seems to be some sort of switch, and they become much more efficient. They are still able to grow. They are still able to go into egg production. And there's and largely that's because the amount of heat loss has been significantly reduced. So it's just that that sort of waste side of production of energy usage is reduced. They become much more efficient with every bit of energy that comes into them. So they're using it for very intentional reasons, growth and production. So.
Thank you, Val. I'm going to go back to Gina for the next question. And it is, would you expect to see the fertility advantages reported to be the same for natural versus artificial insemination mating?
Now that one, I don't guess I'd ever thought about that put quite that way. Generally we do expect similar. I I don't believe that we necessarily expect exactly the same. We also, a lot of people have looked at those slides and said, wow, if I had fertility that low, again, remember that we inseminate these hens once and we look at fertility over the next 14 days. So the fertility, we're giving a fairly low dose and we're looking at the fertility decline from that low dose. So the values themselves are lower. And perhaps you would not expect quite as much of an improvement. But again, I don't have any data to base that on. So obviously, we're hoping that we're going to get a similar improvement from naturally mated birds, for sure.
There's always another question to make more research. I always say, if research could be done the first time, we would just call it search. We try it,
That's
we
right.
try it again, and we've had new, as we answer questions, we just make more a lot of the time. We have another couple minutes, so I'm going to go to this one. Are you able to switch male diets mid-flock?
We essentially do that a lot with both males and females. If we institute a new diet, it's across the board with an integrated operation. So we are essentially changing them mid-flock. It's probably not preferable because these birds are creatures of habit. They like the same thing every day at the same time of day. Not to excite them in any way. But again, there's no real firm evidence. There's I would say no improvement, by switching flocks. Usually we want consistency for them. But if I had a new diet and need to implement it, of course, we're going to move forward with that.
Cool, thank you. I'm realizing that the time on my computer and the time that it actually is are actually a little different. So we've actually gone a couple minutes past the time that we had intended. There are still a few questions and there's more coming in. So I'm just going to check and see with Val and Gina if it's okay if we stick around for a few more minutes. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay, perfect. So we got a question here about relaxing the degree of feed restriction. Does relaxing the degree of feed restriction increase body fat at all? And are there any benefits for egg production with this? And then how important are fat stores actually for egg production?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we know just from the study that we did that, there were differences in fat stores if the birds were full fed versus restricted. So, perhaps if we released feed restriction, we would maybe guess that there'd be more fat put on, but we don't know for sure. I mean, we just did the two extremes, right? That or the extreme of totally releasing them from feed restriction. I mean, there is room for work to be done there, and it's not just releasing feed restriction. Is not the same across the board. It depends when you do it is the other thing. How the hormonal control of nutrients changes as the bird is developing. So it's not just how much, but when is also a big part of that question. And then I think the other part of the question, would it improve egg production? Again, it's hard to know. These birds are quite efficient. What we found here in this study, in the past when we had birds that were full fed, they had that overabundant ovary, that the picture that I showed was like 22 follicles. We didn't see that in this trial. We didn't see, I think we saw one ovary that had a lot of follicles, and by a lot I mean like 15, still not 22. But we didn't see, at one time we used to see double and triple hierarchies. That was kind of the norm in a full-fed bird. We didn't see that in our 2015 birds. So there is, I think, already some changes in how that ovary or those nutrients are being packaged into the ovary. And so how they respond to excess feed. And so therefore maybe we'll see improvements, but it maybe isn't as dramatic as it might have been if we were to look at a 1978 bird or something else. So yeah, like Brenda said, there's more questions to be answered.
always more questions, always.
Yeah, that's kind of the point of having these discussions and why we want to get there.
Exactly.
These are the things we need to look at.
So we have 2 questions left, but they're kind of, they're very similar in scope. So Val, you talked about feed efficiency, looking at old and modern strains, and there's a lot we can learn from that. And that leads into the other question. And when you think about feeding the hens today, do they require more feed than they did in the past? Because you talked about, the metabolic priority towards breast meat, and then egg production was kind of a secondary thing. So any comments about that?
Yeah, I think when we're thinking, when we think about feeding broiler breeders today, the word that comes into my mind, and I'm not thinking of it just from a buzzword point of view, but I really do think sustainability is something we need to be thinking about. So often, I understand it, production and profit makes the money go round, but we have a social responsibility as well. We know more about understanding welfare and things like that. So we need to be thinking from a sustainable approach. We need to make sure that we're still getting the number of chicks that we need to supply the supply chain. But we need to also be thinking, what else is going on? How is the health and welfare of these birds being affected? And if we feed them more feed, what's shifting? Are we still being able to produce the number of eggs, but perhaps maybe supporting the birds to be more healthy, or to be in a higher state of welfare? I can't imagine that. Trust me, I've been on my share of diets, though it might not look like it. It's stressful. And I think for these birds that go their whole life being on a fairly strict diet, if you will, I can't imagine that doesn't create some level of discomfort or stress for them. So we're going to find out more. We've got more speakers talking about that, but maybe we have to start thinking about beyond just eggs and sort of our social responsibility as well in feeding these birds. So I would say that adjusting the feed levels, there's room, I think, and when you do it and how you do it and with what kind of nutrients you do it to support breast yield or to support fat development. What are we driving for in order to meet all of those, that sort of balanced approach? So lots of questions.
Lots of questions and lots of things to consider, most definitely. So
Gina has a comment.
Oh, Gina does. Okay, well, I don't want to.
I was just going to interject and say, if we think about it from a very simplistic point of view, the broiler is much more efficient than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So obviously the breeder has to be more efficient. And so if we feed them the same level of feed we did 20 years ago, we're going to have a big old bird. So again, they are definitely more efficient. We can't continue to feed them as concentrated a diet because their appetite, I talk about that on the rooster side, but it applies on the female side too. She's not satisfied by the amount, the volume we're giving her. And I truly believe that impacts our feather pecking and licking that we see. That's very common negative behavior in these birds. So I think it's just proving that, what we're feeding them is not satisfying to them.
Yeah, for sure. And that feather pecking, feather loss, we see a lot of that. So, we might be getting eggs, but are they fertile? Because when those birds are naked like that, they're not wanting to mate. So it's again trying to move all of these things at the same time and trying to look at the intended and maybe the unintended consequences. But for sure, trying to satisfy the birds is the first step.
Absolutely.
Definitely. Well, with that, we have gone about 10 minutes past our time. So thank you, Val and Gina, for making the extra time. And I can see that the vast majority of people hung out with us to the very end. So thank you very much, everybody.